Hello and welcome back. It's still spooky season. Let us travel 20 years back in time. It's a long time. It's a generation ago to the time of 2004 for a film called Van Helsing. Is it scary because it's scary? Or is it scary because it's bad? It depends on who you ask. So what's up? I'm John Stark from MacMovieGuy.com, and this is how I do spooky season. I'm a blind film critic, and this movie is currently available on Netflix with audio description. So, and it's celebrating its 20th anniversary. Another reason I wanted to pull this out is I also already this year celebrated The Mummy's 25th anniversary because that movie premiered in 1999. So this is like the year of Stephen Sommers. We're just getting it. I'm getting my Stephen Sommers fix. So Van Helsing. Saw this in theaters. I actually worked in a theater when this first came out. I didn't like it. I didn't like it. So this is, I think, only my second time having ever seen Van Helsing. And so obviously I'm older, I'm wiser, I'm a little bit different. And I'm like, and I've seen obviously an infinitesimal amount of movies in the last 20 years, just like an ungodly amount of movies. So obviously my perception of what is good and what is bad, when you add 20 more years on top of it, really we should be talking to a whole bunch of like 80-year-olds and be like, what is your favorite movie? And it's like, I don't know, I've seen 40,000 movies. You know, it's like, the perspective on what is bad and what is good just slowly changes over time. So I don't think it's as bad as I thought originally in 2004, when I was just so underwhelmed by this film. And I think a lot of people were. The box office was underwhelming. It was an expensive production. It didn't make a lot of money. It was supposed to be this hot new property for Universal. Obviously, Stephen Sommers did such a really good job with The Mummy that they were like, well, why don't we have you on this? And let's see if we can kickstart something here. Maybe like a Van Helsing franchise for Hugh Jackman, who's getting really popular now that he's Wolverine. Why don't we make him something else and really ride this A-list wave of Hugh Jackman? Plus they have Kate Beckinsale, who is also exploding around the same time. This is when she starts doing Underworld. So she's a great co-lead, really, for Hugh Jackman. So it follows sort of a non-traditional view of the Van Helsing story, and goes a little bit more in the path of sort of what it feels like. This is like Universal has always wanted to do Dark Universe. They just have never really known how to do it. So when you look at like Universal's classic movie monsters of yesteryear, films which, by the way, don't have audio description, which absolutely should. It's like a sad crime that nobody ever talks about. But all those classic movie monster movies, Frankenstein, the original Mummy, Phantom of the Opera, the Boris Karloff stuff from back in the day is sadly not audio described. So when you think about what Universal was trying to represent with their monsters, I think the first step was, okay, so they revived it with the Mummy. And then they obviously started looking at some other things, like we had that the Wolfman movie with Benicio del Toro and Anthony Hopkins that came after Van Helsing. So they had this on the brain, so to speak. They were like, well, let's see what we can do here. There was also the Phantom of the Opera movie musical that released around the same time as Van Helsing. So Yeah, it's sort of like indirectly related to the Universal movie monster, but certainly helping the general theme. Now, the problem is that with Van Helsing, they kind of threw everything into one film. So I don't really know what the sequel potential was here because he's already fighting. In the first film, he has to fight, you know, a, a wolf man slash werewolf, however you want to refer to it. He has to fight uh, Dracula. He has to fight Frankenstein's monsters in this. Um, so he's already going after some of the key figures sort of rolled into one, and we get a lot of these side characters all in the same film, obviously, Dr. Frankenstein and Igor, and so they sort of already have a place in the Van Helsing world, even though this feels like it should have started out more as like a Dracula film, just focusing on a vampire angle instead of like a broad stroke uh catch-all for everything, which is what it really is it feels overstuffed. I think that's probably the biggest problem with Van Helsing, um is that it tried to do too much, and you feel it because it's a little too long at like 2 hours and 20 minutes, I think, ish. um it's a little bit much for mass appeal, for this kind of a film. And when you realize the reason why it's 2 hours and 20 minutes is because they're throwing in all of these other things, and it gets kind of like all clustered in together. You're like, are you really trying to build a franchise here? Because it feels like you're trying to use up all the properties in the first film. Like, what is his option for the next film? Is he gonna go fight the mummy now? Like, is Steven Sommers gonna make another mummy movie, but like with Van Helsing? Because like the mummy's one of the few people. I guess Creature from the Black Lagoon is not here, but like there are very few options for him after this. I don't even know what the pitch for Van Helsing 2 would be if they're leaning on their classic movie monsters. They even tackle Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein. So uh, they tackle so many different things in this one film that I don't quite get the the shock and awe from Universal. They're like, oh, this didn't work. And it's like, yeah, dude, when you throw in like a whole bunch of franchises. I mean, could you imagine if instead of Iron Man being the first film, if they had just thrown like every Marvel property into the same film and they were just like Marvel the movie, you know, and Iron Man's first movie is him like exploring, and like the X-Men are there, Fantastic Four and the Avengers, and he's got like Hulk, and you're just like, oh my God, are there any characters left to debut? No, we put them all in the first movie. I hope it's not too much. We left out the Guardians, though. Nobody knew who they were. So I guess the sequel would be Guardians of the Galaxy. Iron Man and the Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, like, that wouldn't have worked. And Marvel there would be no MCU because people would have been like, okay, well, this is ridiculous. But when you look at when you look at a streamlined story and you see, okay, so we have hero, villain, plot. Hero, villain, plot. It's really all you need. And it worked for The Mummy. That is what The Mummy is, with Brendan Fraser, directed by Steven Sommers. Hero, villain, plot. Adventure. Passable visual effects. Damsel in distress slash girl boss character with Rachel Weisz. So yeah, it has all of the things that you need to make that film work. And then if you look at other sort of franchises things, if you notice, generally the first thing in a franchise, they don't do more than one villain. Like the first Batman movie, Tim Burton's first Batman was Joker. He went with Joker. Yes, they expanded to two in the sequel, kind of, sort of. If you, depending on how you view Michelle Pfeiffer's character, is she full on villain or is she like both playing at both sides? So they kind of expanded beyond that in the sequel. But the first film, they were like, okay, Batman, Joker. This is an easy concept. First Spider-Man movie. right? Spider-Man, Green Goblin, easy concept. X-Men, X-Men Brotherhood, you know, X-Men versus Magneto and not even the full Brotherhood of Mutants. If they had too many on screen, they felt like it would have been confusing. So he only had a very limited amount of people uh, to assist him, and also the X-Men were very limited too. They had to keep that roster down really low, even though they had like a bajillion people to choose from. So when you look at the success of some other franchise launches, it's very simple: hero, villain, plot. This is hero, villains, plot. And it doesn't really work because it's sort of like scattershot all over the place. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not at all entertaining or that it is irredeemably bad. Um, it just means it doesn't work as a successful entity of a film. So I think comes out, instead of being necessarily a bad film that people might have heard about and been like, oh, well, that doesn't work. I think it just is a film that just doesn't work. It's just kind of like an average, sort of like, well, you know, I think there are things about Fantastic that work, but when you look at the overall film, it ended up failing. So, uh, I would say probably the history is remembering Van Helsing in the right way, but in a very unfortunate way. And in a way that I don't quite understand why they decided to throw everything into one film. Like we'll never get to do this again. And it's like, well, that's up to you. I mean, you're the studio. Even with Van Helsing, they could have ordered a sequel. I mean, it's that if somebody at the top is just saying yes or no, it's like, if you really want a sequel to Van Helsing, then have a sequel to Van Helsing. You know, it's just, there's nothing really stopping you from making a sequel to Van Helsing. It can just underperform. Um, like we haven't made sequels to movies that were like, before. Uh, like that's never happened. But uh, yeah, I mean, it did break 100 at the box office. So I would a sequel have been that weird? No, especially if they had budgeted it differently. Especially if they had come back around and been like, okay, well, let's figure out how do we streamline this, and just sat down if they cared, but they just didn't want to do it. So if they had actually tried to figure out maybe like what were the critics saying about the film, like what was the audience reaction, like why did this kind of peak out lower than they thought it was going to, but instead they just threw it out. They're like, no, killed the fire, much like you probably should with the monsters in the film. But um so yeah, I rewatched this 20 years later, and now I've seen Van Helsing twice in my lifetime. So uh, I have a slightly more favorable opinion only because of that. Uh, there's something about when you look at things with rose-colored glasses. I think there has to be like a different saying for looking at things that you disliked and how you can end up disliking them more over the course of time than you actually did before. And like if you have an unfavorable opinion of something and then you let it sit for 20 years, then it's like, oh man, that was really bad. And it's like, I don't think it was really bad. I don't even think this was like the worst film that I saw in 2004, but it's funny that over 20 years, I was just like, oh no. Oh god, no. No, nope. So I'm glad I revisited it. And if it hadn't had audio description, I wouldn't have done it. So, because I realized it's not a terrible film. It's just a very average film that doesn't work. There's some solid direction here. I like Hugh Jackman's performance. I like Kate Beckinsale's performance. Um, they don't really feature any of the monsters uniquely in a way that really shows off any of their performances. So it's really hard to pick one of them out and be like, oh, well, that was a solid performance from even the guy that they've got running around with them. That's their version of uh, Q from Bond, but it's not really like Carl, I think was his name. Uh, he doesn't really have much of a character. He's just sort of like the gadget guy. So yeah, Hugh and Kate helped this movie out a lot, and Steven Summers is a fairly competent director. So a lot of the action sequences are engaging. He unfortunately allowed this film to have too much going on, and he thought he could handle it. Uh, it's like when you're, it's like somebody being really good at juggling three balls, and then somebody's like, "Good, okay, so here's some chainsaws," and then you're like, "Oh yeah, I could do that because I can juggle three balls." Okay, pause. Let's think about this. But can you? Before we start throwing those chainsaws in the air. Anyway, um, so I'm just gonna give Van Helsing a C. I don't think it's nearly the uh, I don't know, the travesty that some may think it is. I just think it's whatever. It didn't work. Nice try. Try again later with which they did with Dark Universe, which also has not worked for them. So, anyway, thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I will see you guys on the other side.